All right, well, before we jump in, since Benji hasn't been here, does anyone want to kind of share a broad overview or a few points for him to catch up on? Because I know he's probably a pretty diligent student, but I'd imagine you haven't listened to every lesson yet.
Yeah.
We've been learning about the U.S. Constitution. The first week we started out kind of learning about the different houses, which was the Senate and the House of Representatives. And we also did a sort of like a research project, kind of. We looked up an article on our new, I forgot what Supreme Court Justice, right?
Yeah, nominee, yep.
Okay, and we did a couple things like that, and I don't exactly remember what else. We did a couple, like how we had to argue on why, I don't remember exactly what it was. It was like arguing on why we should wear masks. We all had to pick why we should wear masks, even if we didn't think that was an actual thing. And we've kind of been doing debates and stuff like that on the U.S. Constitution.
Good. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, we've each had a week too that we've been picked to go over the different articles as well. We ended on, what article was it?
We're all done.
We're the last article?
Yeah, we went through all the articles.
Oh, right. All I did 3. But yeah, Esther went through the president and talked about what that was. And then I did Article 3. I think you did 4. 4? No.
I should have did 3.
3. Oh, and I did 2. So.
Yeah, so we're taking a look at the Constitution as a whole, and the goal of it is not to just memorize dates, times, figures, but really to ask the question, how does it apply to us? Why do we have it? What's its purpose? How does it play out in our life today? And so to kind of give the really broad strokes to it, the preamble of the Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And so the purpose of it, the Constitution, ultimately is about a people. We, the people. And it's about creating a more perfect union. How do we work together? And we're comparing that to modern times where, if you look at our landscape of the country, probably not really working together, are we? There's not really a big commitment towards the advancement of we the people, or the union being perfected, certainly. And so what's important to note before we get into today, because we're going to start talking about the amendments, and then if you're willing to and ready to, I'm going to assign you to lead class next week. So we'll throw you right in the deep end. If you don't want to, you want to wait a couple weeks, then that's all right as well. But the broad strokes of the Constitution talk about the 3 different branches of government. So legislative, executive, judicial. That we find in the legislative branch, there's 2 different houses. This came about because of the great, fill in the blank, what was it, the great?
Compromise.
Mm-hmm. The Great Compromise. And so what that did was it established a Senate that we have that has equal representation. So no matter how big the states are or how small the states are, every state has 2 senators. Then we have a House of Representatives, which is directly represented by the people, so it's based on population. And so the goal of that would be that laws have to pass through both houses, and you wouldn't just have big states with a lot of people get to kind of call all the shots. So you have the Senate, who's there to be, remember that wise old man, right? And that Naomi said was like her dad, the really wise old man. And so something that's established is there for a little bit longer time, and then you have the House of Representatives that we use the analogy is like a dog on a leash, like it's a wild dog. So it's a little bit younger, a little bit more energetic, represents the people, can come in and out of office a lot quicker, tends to. And so the kind of the balances of that as far as passing our laws is we have that slow and steady Senate, and then the passionate House of Representatives. And then those are counterbalanced by the executive branch, where we have a president and a vice president. And the goal of the president and the vice president is not, right, to be the overseers, and they're not telling people what to do. But they are meant to represent the people well, and to make sure that the laws that are passed that are executed, that's why we have the executive branch, right, executed according to the Constitution, that they will faithfully uphold the Constitution. We have the judicial branch, which is the judiciary, which ultimately will decide whether or not things are actually constitutional. And so we need to have, right, that judge that will fairly discern and decide between that. And then the following articles Elijah shared, rightly so. The rest of the articles kind of encapsulate that kind of the how do we do all of this? How do we pass amendments? How do we have relationships between the states? And what happens when we have a federal law versus a state law? And how the federal law then has supremacy, so it's called the Supremacy Clause. And so basically how things work together. And so I'm giving you a very brief overview. And so kind of the important thing to note, and putting it into an analogy that I think would work really well for us, would be we're all represented here by different families. And so we have different families that represent our group. So coming from different backgrounds, different understandings, different things. But the goal is, even in the context of our group, right, is to create a more perfect union with the Father amongst ourselves. And that requires then of the people, right, we the people, to interact with one another, to be open and honest, to listen, to learn, to grow. At times there's compromise, but in that structure too there's leadership, correct? And what do the people rightfully do when there's leadership is to submit to it. And we see that's kind of the great ideal even in the context of our modern culture, that the people are submitted unto the leadership, but it is a leadership that they willingly submit to, because in an ideal world, and we're not in an ideal world right now, the leadership represents the people well. And ultimately what the Constitution talks about and what we're after is that there is an ordaining and an establishing of leadership. And so there's a hierarchy, sure, but the goal of any good leadership is, again, not about the leaders having power and telling people what to do, but that it represents the people to what? Ultimately to the sovereign, our higher power, to the Father. And so as we begin this week, what we're going to start to do is get into the actual, like, basic rights. What do we enjoy as citizens of this republic, right? Because it's not a democracy, it's a republic. What are the benefits that we get to enjoy? And where are the arguments that are brought forth? And so Kayla's going to share today the First Amendment, which is a pretty significant conversation to have. And so my hope, again, today is for you, Benji, just to kind of know the ground rules here is the goal of this is not for me to teach and give you a bunch of information that you will likely forget. The purpose of this and the goal will be that we're going to take some time to actually kind of debate or discuss our own thoughts and opinions. And so I would encourage you, don't be shy. Just say what you think. I will at times push back a little bit. I will take the opposite side of things for a reason, because my hope out of this course is that we don't just download information, but we really learn how to weigh it out. Because what is critical for your generation, because it is really your generation from a national sense or a political sense, that will take the lessons that are learned and apply them correctly, or you will find, like my generation and the generation before us, that has not done a really good job of really upholding the ideal that is set forth. We've become more divisive, particularly in my generation and the generation before. Our parents, my parents' generation, so your grandparents, a bunch of rebels, really kind of started it off. And so we see that in the 60s and 70s with the hippie movement, and kind of a breaking away of authority and, down with the man. I know you guys don't do that, right? You guys submit to your parents perfectly. There's no problems with authority. But we see that play itself out, again, historically, time and again. And what the Constitution is intended to do is to be framed. It's the house, right? There's the framing of the house. There's the foundation is built upon this ideal that all men are created equal by their Creator. The idea of the Constitution is that it's framed in. So we have walls, we have rooms and stuff like that. And what is the purpose of the house? To be lived in, and so that it's actually lived out. So there's no point to building a constitution, having a foundation, if we're not going to live it out. Right? What's the point of following the Constitution or following the Lord if we're not going to live it out? Right? If the Bible is just a book that we read, and it's not living, it's not active in our lives, then all it is a book. And we can't say that we're of the household, right? We can't be in the house of God if we don't practice the ways of the Lord, if we don't set our hearts to follow His mandates. Correct? So that's a broad overview. Did I miss anything? Naomi, look at me like I missed something. Did I miss something? Okay. All right, Kayla D.
So this is the first Federalist Papers or the First Amendment. I don't think they're the same thing. I'm pretty sure. And in the first Federalist Papers or the First Amendment, they talk about three main freedoms that we got out of it, which was the freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, and the freedom of religion. The freedom of speech is pretty much what it sounds like, where you were allowed to have your own opinion and kind of say that, which sometimes can't be, like now we probably should have kind of not given everyone the exact freedom to talk about what they want. And I think religion terms kind of, or like political terms, but it is pretty much what it sounds like, how you can say what you want and have your own opinion, because before that there was only a few people who could have their own opinions and speak the way that they wanted to. So I guess, yeah, that was a pretty awesome freedom. We have the right to bear arms, which is able to have your own weapons. I don't exactly remember where this started from, but it's also pretty much what it sounds like. All of these are pretty much what they sound like. The right to bear arms, it means you're allowed to have your own weapons in your own home under a certain circumstance. And then the freedom of religion, which was the freedom to have your own religion. But I think before that, a lot of the Americans had to be under the rights of Britain's religion, which was Roman Catholic, and then a couple other ones I wrote down, but I did not bring my notebook that I forgot. So, yeah, those are the three main freedoms. I can't think of anything else that's like super duper important about it, because it was kind of short few papers. That's pretty much all sums up to, we got three main rights from it, and it was signed by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. Yeah. John Jay.
Good. Yeah, right. And so you branched in a little bit into the Second Amendment there, which is important. And I'm glad you caught this, because a lot of people don't. And so, good job. Federalist Papers. Have you guys read the Federalist Papers? Probably not priority reading. Okay. So, so we got to understand some context here. And again, Kayla did a really good job. The First Amendment is so critical. I mean, it's probably considered the most important amendment that we have in the Constitution. Hence the reason they put it first. And Kayla rightfully said it was born out of the Federalist Papers that were trying to make 3 points. Now they broke those 3 points out a little bit. We went into the Second and Third Amendments, which we'll get in next week. If you want to cover those, let me know. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. But to kind of step back, the Federalist Papers were written really kind of with the ideal to gather public support. And so this would be kind of the modern way of like writing, a blog or having a vlog or something like that, getting on your tickety talks. That's a thing, right? No? So basically, people who had something important that they wanted to say to rally a group behind, right? And so think about, really quickly, who are some people that influence you outside of your family? So let's not, outside of our community, what are things, and it doesn't have to be, don't feel like you have to overly spiritualize it. It could be like, I just really love, hooded sweatshirts. And so this is the person I listen to. But who are people that influence you? And what do they influence you about? I mean, that's a pretty major thing right now in our society is influencers. I mean, there's people that make money to just go on social media and tell you what you should buy from Amazon. Right? I mean, I'm old, but I'm right?
Yeah.
So what are some of those people for you?
I feel like there's a lot of people on YouTube
Mm-hmm.
that you go and watch, and just like you said, they have videos where they suggest places to get, clothes or even stuff that is trendy or trending. So YouTube is, I think there's a lot of different people, like no one specific, but like I just feel like YouTube is a big place where a lot of it, and then like TikTok and stuff too, or like whatever. I don't even know what you call those, just the random small videos that are used these days for that kind of stuff. And I feel like that's a pretty big influence too on a lot of people. Yeah.
Do you find yourself influenced by some of that stuff?
I do, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, we have systems in place because of the computer and the internet and all of that will, and whether you think it's happening or not, will shift your perspectives, right? We have marketing now where people make millions upon millions of dollars for ad agencies. We think of like, when I say names like Coca-Cola, can't you like picture the imagery of Coca-Cola right away? Like Coca-Cola, what color represents Coke? Like automatically.
Red.
Right. I'm like you get it, like automatic. Okay, so the Federalist Papers were kind of the very first kind of ideal. Back then when they only had the printing press, and that wasn't really wide. It wasn't like everyone could have a printing press, right? And so if you had printing presses, that was pretty significant. You had an advantage to control the culture in some form or fashion, right? Because you could get whatever you believed out there pretty quickly. And so they would have, people that would also go from town to town. And so we see like, Paul Revere. We all know the story of Paul Revere, right? Who went from town to town saying the redcoats are coming. And so we want to think in terms of back then, how much different it is than our society. Whoever controlled printing presses in general controlled the messaging. And so what the Federalist Papers did for America was really critical. And sorry, I almost called you Nicole. Kayla, just like her mom, rightfully said it was Hamilton and Madison and John Jay primarily. And so do we know who Alexander Hamilton is? Kind of, right? If you've watched the Disney Plus show on it, they made a big play out of it. But basically, he was really instrumental early on. In fact, we get the U.S. Treasury as kind of his brainchild, and so the fact that we have a U.S. Treasury comes out of that. But he was a really thoughtful man and had some really ideas on why we should be Federalists. And so a Federalist was somebody who believed that we needed to have a stronger federal government, right? And so remember, the Constitution was formed in part because the Articles of Confederation were weak. It established for us a good idea of what statehood should be, but we needed to take all of those states and unite them. And then we had Madison. Do we know who Madison is?
James Madison?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of too.
So he becomes a president.
Yeah.
He's one of the founding fathers, but was the primary author of the Constitution. So he was the guy, like Thomas Jefferson was the Declaration of Independence. Madison was to our Constitution, and then John Jay is actually our first Supreme Court justice. And so we have here, interestingly enough, represented with three men: the judiciary, the executive, and then Hamilton was very much like the legislative branch. And so, interestingly enough, that's how it kind of played out. And so they wrote all of these papers to kind of rally people around this idea of we should have very certain freedoms, and we should really begin to amend our Constitution in a way that defines these freedoms out for us. And as Kayla rightly said, there are some pretty major ones. Ultimately, I'll just read through the First Amendment here. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What does that mean? It's a lot of words. And so there's five freedoms here that it talks about. And it was actually taken from the Federalist Papers, two of which Kayla really highlighted that were really important. And what were those two that were really important?
The freedom of religion and the freedom of speech.
Freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So why do you think that those two would be critical, not only to us now, but why are those two critical to the framers of the Constitution when they're beginning to establish the order of this new nation? Why is speech and religion, do you think, important, those freedoms?
Because it gives people a chance to say what they think and feel instead of keeping it all inside.
Okay.
It's more of a working together even, and not having one person tell everyone what to do. It's having everyone work together and have their say and stuff.
Yeah.
With speaking. Religion, I feel like, is similar, but some people don't have the same religion, so that's kind of doing your own thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets tricky. You kind of alluded to something. They set this up like really broad strokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like freedom of speech. So let's talk about it. Should certain speech be limited? Thinking of the Constitution, is there types of speech that we should make illegal? Or is there types of speech that is illegal?
I don't think it's bad for like people to have what they want to say, but like, because I think that kind of like makes people not really like want to take down the government, you know, like they want people to feel equal to them also, and to say what they want to say to make what they think a better place.
Yeah. Important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, speech is so critical. But there's a balance and a counterbalance to it, right? Like, and we want to think in these terms. Like, how many of you have ever had a disagreement with a sibling, a parent, a friend, where you wanted to say what you felt, but you didn't want to hear what they had to say? Has anyone ever experienced that?
Many times.
Right? Like, that's kind of again, in us, human nature. And the framers, again, of the Constitution are really mindful of this, of not just what sounds good. They weren't trying to create this, like, utopian society, you know, where things, you know, they just pretend like things work. They were really trying to resolve real issues. Remember that they come from a monarchy and parliaments and places where they weren't represented. They didn't have a voice. This is where we get terms like taxation without representation. Give me liberty or give me death, right? The framers and the early revolutionaries were much more willing to die for what they believed than they were to just blindly go along with what somebody told them. So speech is really critical in establishing real relationship.
Maybe if we did tone back on something, maybe the hate about our presidents, because lately there's been a lot of hate on all presidents that we've had the last couple.
Well, let's talk about that. Would it be constitutionally protected for me to say I don't like the president? Would that be safe to say?
Mm-hmm.
What if I said I'm going to kill the president? Is that constitutionally protected?
No.
Well, we're getting onto some shaky ground here, right now. So some of our speech is limited in scope, right? Because there's some forms of speech that turn into threats, right? And this is one of the things that we're actually dealing with a lot right now. I mean, we see more recently some conversation about, in particularly school boards and parents going to school boards and some side thinking that parents shouldn't be able to say what kids have the rights to do or say in schools or have certain protections there. There's another side that's saying, well, they should be able to do whatever. And so as we get into this, it's a really good reason why we have the judiciary now. Because when we say freedom of speech, that's pretty broad. Pretty broad. And so what I would liken this to is there's a principle in the Bible, right, that all things are permissible, but not all things are profitable. We have freedom, right? It's a freedom to speak. I have the freedom to speak as I see fit. But with that, there's also consequences, correct? There's consequences for the way that I conduct myself. So I can alienate people I could hurt people. I mean, I could yell at you guys to tell you how to do school. Would that profit me at all? Would that benefit you? No. I can try to engage and ask questions, but speech is central and critical because it is the primary way that we communicate as people. Is through speech. Right? I mean, you guys, you don't get up in the morning and then just look at each other and know what each other is saying. You have to communicate. There has to be conversation. And in a healthy environment that is trying to get to, again, that ideal of, we're trying to create a more perfect union. Naomi, you said it perfectly. There's got to be conversation. There's got to be a feeling like what I bring to the table is going to be okay. It's not going to get shouted down. Because if you have relationships where you get to say nothing and you just have to follow it and there's no dialogue or conversation, that's a pretty unhealthy dynamic. Think about this for a second, the way that the Father operates his culture. Does not the Father allow his people to go boldly before the throne room of grace? That's a profoundly deep thought. That we have the right to go to our Father with our wants, our needs, our supplications. Good times, bad times, ugly times, difficult times. The Father cares about our hearts. He cares about what's going on in our minds. He cares about the way we commune with him, right? This is where we get that fancy word, communion. That's what it means, right? And so putting this in a really practical area, speech is so vital to what we do. So why should we not have, though? So give me the counterbalance to this argument. What would be some arguments why the freedom of speech shouldn't be an amendment? Why is the freedom of speech not a good thing?
Okay, I think because anybody being able to say whatever they want, speech is having a really big influence on people. So, and sometimes it won't be a good influence, and then everyone being able to say whatever they want couldn't be very good.
Excellent. Yeah, it makes us susceptible to any type of speech. So, how are freedoms best? How do we really enjoy our freedoms? If we're going to talk about this, right? Because we're going to talk about these freedoms. How do we, as we the people, how should we enjoy our freedoms?
Using them correctly in the way they were supposed to be given.
Good. Yeah. True freedom is not permission to do whatever we want. That's not real freedom. In fact, freedom outside of obedience is not freedom at all. Real freedom, true freedom, biblical freedom, actual freedom is rooted in obedience to something greater than yourself. And the reason that is free, that's real freedom, is that, again, freedom in our rights doesn't just consider the needs of the individual. It considers the needs of all of us, we, the people. And when that gets missed, what we see is a torn and fractured government. When we look at historically the United States, I mean, there was a pretty major engagement that happened because we disagreed. We had a whole war over it. And what was that war called?
The Civil War.
The Civil War. What was the reasons we fought the Civil War?
Slavery.
That's one of them.
Was it different opinions from certain other
Mhm.
things?
Yeah.
Like the freedoms, some of the freedoms that we had.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't primarily slavery, although we tend to believe that. The whole premise of the Civil War started when the southern states wanted to secede from the Union. They wanted to break away. Because they believed they were trying to exalt states' rights and saying, and slavery kind of slides into that, right? So they wanted to have the slave trade be okay amongst other rights. And so they wanted to break away from the United States because there was a really mounting pressure. Slavery was supposed to end completely by this time. That, in the eyes of the framers, that was the goal when they set out to to found our country. But there was a lot of other, little minute issues. And basically what happened was, remember, as we talked about in the Constitution, the balance between states' rights and a federal government is that the North tended to be moving a little bit more towards the federalist side of things, and the states wanted a little bit more freedom from some things, and so there was kind of a tearing away. Well, the whole war really was fought to try to bring us together, and that was the premise of it. So think about that for a minute. We're going to fight with one another to be unified. That's a pretty significant event in American history. We ever think of things that way? We're gonna fight adamantly so that we can be unified. See, most people are just willing to go their separate ways and say, "Well, just be done with that." But there's something more at play here, and ultimately, what we see bear out in the Civil War and what we're seeing now, the symptomology of things as far as our freedoms go, is how do we limit our freedoms individually for the good of everyone. And that kind of takes some understanding and nuance, right? Because there's times where you got to stand up for yourself, right? There's times where would you say it's fair to say that there's times where you should have a voice and you should speak up for yourself? And then there's probably times where it benefits you and the other person more when you refrain from speaking. So how do you discern what is right and wrong in those times? So let's pretend for a second that somebody in your life upset you, a friend, and they really did something to you that really bothered you, and your first initial response was you're really angry and you were gonna say something, but you decided to refrain from a minute, and you're in this position now of really trying to think it through. Am I gonna say something? Am I not gonna say something? Walk me through your process. What would you do in that regard? How would you manage making that decision?
I do not know.
Well, that's definitely one response. to freeze and just go,
I think it depends on what kind of person you are. If you're very stubborn, you would say something immediately, and if you're sensitive, you'd be like, okay, whatever. But then you might be someone who will deal with it later. I don't know which one of those I am.
Good. Yeah, temperaments. So that's it. Psychologists call this the fight, flight, or flee response. We'll either fight back, we'll freeze up, or we'll run away as fast as we can. And I don't mean just physically. Emotionally, we might fight. We might just set in our hearts an anger towards them and animosity. We might verbally speak out. We might freeze where I don't know what to do. So you ever have that where something happens to you and your body goes on lock? That's a natural physiological response to stress. Or we'll try to get away from the situation. And that means people will go away and just try to forget about it. You ever have that experience where you're like so angry, but you're just like, I'm just going to forget about it and we're going to try to move on?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those are normal responses. But how do we engage? I mean, again, listen, this is your right. You have a right to speak. And how it plays out in your life is critically important. Not just because it's in the Constitution, but because as a people of God, speech is central to how we relate to one another. So grasping this is not just a constitutional thing. It really is, it's trying for us to understand, how do we apply this in our lives? How does this play itself out? Because it's important. All right, do I need to assign homework to come up with next week? Next week, do we need to figure out how do we resolve interpersonal issues? How do you resolve challenges in your life?
Putting yourself in a place of maybe not saying what you want to say to benefit you both.
Mm-hmm.
Or take it to the Lord.
Take it to the Lord. Yeah. Put yourself in a position. Separate yourself out from the situation. What are some other thoughts? Noah, do you have some thoughts on how you process?
Describe the situation one more time.
Okay, sure. Let's say that you're with a friend and it's just you and your friend says something that, without getting too detailed, like it just is really hurtful to you. It's really offensive to you. It's really hurtful, and your initial response is just anger. And maybe it's almost like this friend. They said something that they knew would hurt you, and they said it anyways. They weren't being thoughtful. They weren't being mindful. It was sharp. And again, your initial response is to lash out, but you choose to go away from it. Now you're having to balance: do I say something to them or not? And if I do say something to them, how do I say it? So what is your process of coming to the conclusion of when to speak and how to speak?
Well, assuming that I was able to control myself, as you're saying, I'd probably, I think as was already mentioned, I'd try to take a stance apart from myself, kind of like Benji was saying. And if I had the insight to do so, I'd maybe try to see from this person's perspective, by also taking into account the fact that, as in most cases, it's very unlikely that someone tries to deride you simply to hurt your feelings, but there's usually a deeper cause than that. And to see if that cause could be discovered anyway, and I would, as a result, probably take a more inquisitive stance, and if I could do so calmly, try to almost interrogate the person as to why they wanted to speak that way and see what the issue actually is. And if I am able to kind of remain apart from my own self and my own feelings, probably work with the person to see if there is a root issue. And I think by also taking that stance of, I guess, patience and kind of separation from the way my feelings want to be exercised in that moment, it'll actually very likely have an impact on the person too, and they'll probably also begin to express themselves in a calmer and more practical way. But that's just assuming, but yeah, that's probably what I do.
That seems like a pretty reasonable and well thought out and articulated answer. Does that sound like freedom more so than somebody who lashes out in anger and just says what they feel in the moment? Right. I think what Noah described for us is true freedom. What we blindly, again, and I really want to try to hammer this point home, because it's, again, what's critical to our studies here is how do we apply this in a national sense of like just our government, but in a personal sense. That true freedom is found in holding back or withholding. In those moments, can you say what you feel? Yes, absolutely. Is it beneficial? Probably not. The Bible tells us, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We have a country of people that say whatever they feel. Is that unconstitutional? No. Does that attitude lead to, again, if the stated goal of the preamble is we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, is that the kind of behavior that we as people need to apply to achieve that goal of unity? No, not always. And again, argument is a really important part of unity. We see that the Civil War, spiritually speaking, really plays this out. Like, there's a fight for unity. God is a jealous God. Like, he will go after that which is trying to pull apart your union with him. Like, he will fight for you. I can relate to that as a parent, somebody trying to harm my kids. Like, I will address that. And my goal will be, or even between siblings, right? Like, because you guys have gotten in trouble, I'm sure, for fights with one another. And you ever get that talk, well, it's your brother, or it's your sister, or you should work together, or you should try. I mean, right? So if the goal is unity, not just for the sake of, like, we're all pretending to get along, but really true unity in our heart, speech is the most important freedom that we have. Because if we do not bridle our tongue in the way that we speak, in the truest sense of freedom, then none of the other freedoms really work. So let's continue to play this out. Let's pretend for a minute that you go back, you've thought it out, you've tried to listen, you have this discussion, and there's just, all of a sudden now there's like this, we're just butting heads. We don't see eye to eye on it at all. We cannot agree. What happens next? And again, assuming that this is something that's really important to you. So it's not just as easy as saying, oh, I'll just be done with it. Like it's still getting at you. I mean, it's getting at you because now, with your good friend here, now there's something there that's between you. And you feel like, I felt important enough to say something to them, and I feel like they're not listening to me. And so, again, it's not as simple as just being like, well, we just don't see eye to eye, so we go our other ways. How do we resolve those things?
I even think that, like, if it was a really big issue and butting heads was, like, or you were really, really mad at each other and it was really heated, stepping away would probably be something that would help, even to have for yourself even a time to think about what was going on and how you could respond.
Good.
I like personally I would do something like that because sometimes I can't, like, right off the bat, like, resolve something like that, so I'd have to think about it, and then I could more easily resolve something and go back and talk to that person and resolve it,
Okay.
hopefully.
Yeah, so a season of separation.
Right.
To just until things kind of, smooth over a little bit. Good. Other thoughts?
Maybe have someone that you can trust, maybe an adult or someone that you can trust that's mature, to help you
Good.
figure it out.
Yeah, you guys hit on the two most important parts: separation and wise counsel. And again, it goes back to when we ask ourselves, why did the framers of the Constitution write the things that they did? It wasn't just because speech sounded like a good idea. It wasn't just that the right to bear arms, which we'll talk about next week, was a good idea. It was very intentional in the way that they set it. Again, it's important that we have these freedoms, but if we don't have a way to regulate these freedoms, which is where we had, all of the articles kind of set that foundation and the framing for all of this stuff. If we don't have that, right? Who is the wise counsel that's supposed to adjudicate matters? Well, it's the judiciary. And so they wrote these laws really broad to have speech, with the understanding that there would be times in history where people would have grievances, one against another, and that it would have to be resolved. And so they would go up through the judiciary, right, starting in the states, working all the way up at times to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court would make pretty major rulings. There was one ruling, not too long ago, that had to do with people trying to limit, I think it was, it might have been like the Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe, that were trying to go door to door and give out tracts, and just hand out their literature, and then a city shut them down, basically. And that was a big kind of argument, and all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held that you can't limit that kind of, regardless of what you feel about it, you can't limit that. Because if you limited people's ability to go house to house and do things like that, you'd have to limit, like, political parties' ability to send out, like, you should vote for this guy or that guy. That is a freedom of speech that should be enjoyed, regardless of the messaging. There's a certain level of, we should be able to do that. You have the freedom to do that. We've had, again, different conversations historically about who gets to speak and when they get to speak and how they get to speak. And all of that, again, is decided on the Supreme Court. But what we need to, I think, understand from that personal first right is that we need to think of it in terms of personal application first. It's kind of like you guys have talked about, putting ourselves in other shoes, right? Do unto others, like really processing that. Because a unified nation is one that is thoughtful and articulate in what we speak. Speech is important. Refraining from speech at times is important. Engaging in debate is important. And again, my hope for us is that we challenge the way that we think when it comes to this stuff. And we really kind of walk that out and say, okay, what do I really believe about this subject or that subject? That when you're interpersonal relationships, when things come up, it's so easy for us to just automatically respond or automatically go away and not put thought to it. But again, if we understand our freedom as sons of God, as constituents, as people of the United States, you have a basic freedom to speak. You don't have to be shy, you can speak. You have permission. And for them, this was really critical because they came from a society that was doing what? It was trying to quench the speech of the colonists. They didn't care about what the colonies wanted at all. There was no representation in Parliament in England. Now, likely, had England in Parliament and the King and that given voice to the Americans, we'd likely still be part of Great Britain. More than likely. But they didn't. And again, this is where the framers kind of push back. So let's look at this again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this is another really important one. And really ultimately, as Kayla pointed out, it is tied together with the freedom of speech. They're linked. You cannot separate the two out from the mind of the framers. Speech and religion. You can't have one without the other. Because this nation was founded on a belief that there is a creator and that we were given certain rights, all of us. Every last one of us. So what does this law mean? There's respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Say it again.
Yeah, let me say it this way, because we have how many of you have ever heard that in the United States we have something called the separation of church and state? That the church cannot influence the state. You've never heard that? Okay. So basically there's this idea of coming again out of the First Amendment. It's really important. This is super important to you guys. So it would be likened to, in some ways, to chill the effect of you speaking in spiritual terms. Think in our culture. What are some really things that you can't say in our culture that are a certain perspective, come from a Christian perspective, that would really upset a lot of people? Is there anything that people? I'm trying not to give you the answers here. I really want you guys to think in terms of what are some things or subjects that are talked about that people get really upset. That think Christians are hateful because they have certain beliefs.
That we're here to fulfill a purpose for.
Yeah, that's offensive to people.
We're set apart.
That we're set apart. Yep, that's super offensive to people. What about when it comes to people who operate in other lifestyles? So as a Christian, for me to say that homosexuality is not biblical, not healthy, not good, I get some pushback. Quite a bit, right?
Or abortion and stuff like that.
That I believe in. That you don't believe in a woman's right to choose. There's some pushback. And so what they tend to go back to, the argument tend to go back to is, well, there's a separation between church and state. You can't bring up what your beliefs, your biblical beliefs cannot influence what we do as a nation. Why is that wrong? Why is that concept of the separation of church and state from that mindset a wrong understanding? Why is it a right understanding? Maybe you think it's a right understanding.
To have abortion or?
No, that the church, that a religious
Well, it's
group of
keeping it
people.
separate from what they could. I think it's I don't know how to say this. It's really separating because you're not giving the church a say. You're separating it and almost.
You're discriminating against a whole group of people,
Yeah.
which goes against our freedom of speech. And so what happens is that we've had this argument now about the separation of church and state, which you can read the whole Constitution, it's not in there. And so to understand this principle, because the ideal is where they get this is from the First Amendment, is that we don't want to have the church making laws. because the church will make moral laws, and sometimes, things aren't that tidy and that easy or that convenient. And so if the church controlled things like to outlaw, homosexual marriage or homosexuality in general, it's really offensive to people because they come from a different perspective and worldview. But what does the First Amendment say? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which means what? There cannot be any official religion of the United States. And this is important. Now again, understanding that predominantly the people who are framing were Christian or theist, and theists like Thomas Jefferson, he didn't think like we think. He basically cut out all the miracles in the Bible, and we get the Jefferson Bible, because in his mind, a theist believes that there is God, but that God kind of, wound the clock and then took his hands off of it. So there couldn't be any, miraculous things happening. So that was misunderstood. But what you didn't really have with the framers is atheists, or people who didn't believe in God. So they all generally believed that there was a creator and empowered, and that there were different expressions. And what
Thomas Paine.
Yeah, what they were nervous about is the official religion in Britain. So there was Roman Catholic and Anglican. Anglican was really the English version of the Roman Catholic Church. And it broke away basically because one of the kings wanted to get divorced and remarried, and the Roman Catholic Church said no, and he said, well, we're Anglican now, so we got our own thing. And even they've outlawed divorce at any rate. And so now they're coming from this mindset of, well, what is going to quench freedom of speech would be if we had one official way of looking at things, that would be harmful. And so they're not trying to squelch religion, because there's a freedom of religion. So religion is really critical, right? But what does the second thing say? Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now this is important, because what it's saying is that you have the freedom to practice your faith, period. And so when we talk about the church and state, why is it wrongly understood is because the way that the Constitution's language is used is not to stop the church from influencing the country, but keeping the federal government out of the business of the church. And that's a vastly different thing. If we have freedom of speech, then we should have all different types of beliefs and coming forward with how they see it, right? And so when I, as a citizen, as a believer in Christ, as a son of God, come and say, I don't believe there should be abortion. It should be illegal. I have the freedom to say that, and I shouldn't have any reprisal because of that. What has happened in our country is, in some ways, what we're seeing is that our country is dealing with its own kind of state-sponsored religion. It's called secular humanistic theology. What does that mean? Secular means it's kind of the idea of whatever feels good, do it. If you like it, perfectly okay. You wanna have abortion? Who are we to say anything otherwise? You wanna have all of this kind of inappropriate stuff, pornography, whatever. Who cares? It's all great. And then it's humanistic. Humanistic meaning, instead of there being a theistic, right, a submission to anything greater than ourselves, humanistic is about serving myself, right? These are the mindset that comes from, like, again, I'm going to die and nothing happens to me afterwards, so why wouldn't I just party? Right? Like, if there's no end after our life, why would you not do that? And again, a theology is kind of like, what they end up worshiping is not God as we know God. It's the God of self. So we see that culturally, that's a pretty big operation that's going on, whether people realize it or not. Because you have plenty of people that say that they go to the church, but they believe in abortion. I'm a Christian, but I think a woman has a right to choose. Well, is that a biblical... Is that biblically okay? And so now we have this kind of separation and importance of, why do we have the separation of church and state? Again, it's to keep the state, the government, away from people's free expression. And that's a hard thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
I I've heard some people say, like, read the Bible and it doesn't say anything about this. Does it say anything about abortion? Because I know it says not to be homosexual.
Right, so-
but does it say anything about that?
Yeah, well, I would say, right, the Bible talks about, David said in the Psalms, right, that you're fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are knit together in our mother's womb, right? And so how does God see, the best argument for that is, how does God see us? Does he see us with intrinsic value? Yeah, does the Bible talk anywhere about, like, you're really valuable once you're born? Like, God loves you really then? Well, no. Fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together. Like, that's intimate conversation, right? And so we would understand that from a biblical perspective of being, when does life start? When God speaks it forth, right? Real life comes from the mouth, the speech of God, and that happens through conception. Real life happens at conception. So that would be the Christian argument for it. Good question. And so again, we got just a few minutes here. So we're tying this together, right? Now we have a government that cannot dictate or legislate how you worship. And that's critical. And that's hard sometimes, because I think when you are walking in the truth and you see people practicing things that are outside of the truth, that's a difficult thing. But think about this. What is and this is why I think our community does such a phenomenal job of loving the Lord, because most people from a Christian perspective think the way to evangelize is go and tell them how wrong they are and how they need to repent and they need to do this and they need to do that, which is true. They do need to repent and they do need to turn, but they're not going to by you demanding it. Right? Think about the way that, what does the Bible say? What leads to repentance? It's God's kindness. It's his faithfulness. It's his goodness, right? There's a relationship that changes. And so again, if we limit, true understanding is, if we limit our speech, if we limit our ability to have our own way, and we have true freedom, we're able to impact. And so what the framers understood is that if we give people the right to worship freely, there is an opportunity then for people, and an opportunity for people to speak. Then what you'll have is different groups maybe that are now able to influence one another. And then we continue on to these next rights. The right to, or the freedom of the press. Why is the freedom of press important? Well, freedom of press is, again, tied to speech. We don't want to have a government say, this is the only thing that you can print. So if I'm the president, the only thing you can print is favorable to me. It doesn't matter if I'm doing a whole bunch of shady things. This is what's, we want the people to think that I'm doing something good for them. Well, no. You want a press that is free to write different perspectives and to seek the truth, right? Because the goal of the press was to get at the truth. Think about modern times now. What the goal of the press to do is, pretty much when you look at news outlets, they pretty much have an opinion and they're trying to prove their opinion versus trying to be free in their application of that. So you have, ones that lean this way, ones that lean that way, and what they're doing is they're just regurgitating whatever makes them look good. To put that on a personal level, again, if you've ever had an argument with someone, let's say a sibling, and you went to your parents, think about this particularly when you're younger, because I think as we mature, we kind of understand the truth is pretty important, right? And we want to, the truth sets us free. There's real freedom in the truth. But think about when you were a kid and you were like, oh gosh, if I really tell the truth, I'm going to get busted here. And then, so you and your sibling go, and maybe you don't full out lie, but you kind of paint the picture of your side is right? Like you're not trying to represent the truth faithfully. Like you might have said, well, I did this and this and this, but you didn't share the whole heart behind it. Well, that's the reason we want to have a press that is free. We want to have a press that represents, again, the people, and it helps the people to come to an understanding for themselves, instead of a press that takes a side and tries to manipulate you into it. Right? Again, influencers. What are influencers? They're people that are trying to manipulate you into purchasing what they think is right. Now, there can be healthy sides of that, right? And we think, yeah, it's just shoes. Well, it's more than just shoes. Do you ever wonder, like, generally speaking, influencers, are they trying to get you the cheapest version of whatever? Or are they trying to talk you into this more expensive, It's a manipulation tactic. And again, I'm not trying to be critical. So if you're into shoes, it's not about shoes. It's about the tactics that are used. They're trying to influence what you believe. The question I would have for you is, when those people are influencing you, are you pushing back and saying, wait a minute, do I really believe that? Because, and I'm going to go just a few minutes long here. Kayla's grandma, my wife's mom, suffers from COPD, so that's a chronic lung condition. It was brought upon by smoking. So how many of you smoke regularly? You're like 5 packs a day. Why not? Why do we not smoke?
Very bad for your lungs.
It's very bad for your lungs. How do you know that?
Because we've seen it.
You've seen it. Yeah, you practically see it with your eyes. We have tons of studies on this. There's tons of people that still smoke, right? Well, when she was growing up, and so this would be, my parents' age, there was actually articles by the companies that sold tobacco that said smoking is good for you. Everyone used to smoke. In fact, even up until the 80s, everyone did it. Because it was good for you. It was good for your lungs, they said. And they had all of these things, all this promotion out there. It was a flat-out lie. Today, in our society, we have tremendous amounts of drug companies that will say, just use this drug and it'll make you better. And they're super addictive. We know that these drugs have been super addictive forever, and they push this out. Why? And then they make certain drugs to look like candy. Like illegal drugs are promoted to look like candy to kids. Why? Because they're marketing. And so again, why we need to have speech, religion, and then the press is to get at the heart of things. And what your responsibility as an individual is not to take everything that somebody says at face value. Like even today, as we're talking in these classes, don't hear what I'm saying to you and say, well, Justin said it. Because you will not go to God and say, well, Justin said. I'll answer to God for what Justin said, right or wrong. You are responsible. You have the freedom to figure this stuff out. The freedom that you enjoy should inform the way you speak, what you believe, right? That's faith. So again, these are relational terms. What you take in, the press. And then the last things here are the right of the people to peaceably assemble, right? And so we could all go out on the street and we can say, Jesus loves you. And we can do that legally. Now there's people that have gotten around, like on college campuses, like, well, you can have the freedom to do that, but you need to do it over here in this spot. We're going to put you somewhere where there's nobody walks by there. Well, then they've challenged that up to the Supreme Court and saying, no, you can't. You can have spots that are limited so that it doesn't cause, like you can't do it in the middle of the streets. That's not constitutional because it needs to be peaceable. And so you have to provide an opportunity. But it's important that we gather, right? Again, speech, important. But speech that gathers or unifies, having same language, now again, is going from the individual to the collective. And then lastly, and then the petition the government for a redress of grievances. So lastly, why is this tied in there? Basically, this gives us the right to, if we think we're being treated inappropriately by the government, we have a chance to sue the government, to go back after the government, and to try to get some understanding. And then lastly, we'll close on this, but to get back to that point of that conversation between you and your friend, the goal first is as an individual to handle things and to work it through, and hopefully we're dealing with the Lord and we're being mindful of that. But when things don't work, is to have something outside of yourself, right? Godly counsel that we can then bring structure to it. And again, look at how things have been established. We have a judiciary for that. We have a legislature for that, right? To pass laws. So if I see something happening to Benji that I don't like, and he's one of my constituents in my state, I want to pass a law to say, well, look at this. This is going to protect him. The job of the executive is to help.
Kind of like a lawyer.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, so you go to the judge to say this is pleading the case, but ultimately something is decided. So last question, just to put in the back of your mind, will be, what happens though when the Supreme Court gets it wrong? Because we've had that happen in our country. What happens when the judges mess up?
A rebellion.
Could be. Yeah. But again, and that's a good answer. What is the point of the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And so we'll put a pin in that there. I think we're about 4 or 5 weeks away from being done, so I'm going to put into your mind now, the final for this is not going to be a test. It's going to be an essay and an oral presentation. And so what I would like you to do is title the essay either We the People or A More Perfect Union. And then I want you to share kind of the importance of the Constitution. And I want you to argue in practical ways. I don't want a regurgitation of information. This is what it says. I want you to personally apply it to your life. And you could take just the preamble and say, I'm just going to talk about this, or you could take one of the amendments and say, I'm going to talk about this, or you could talk about the president and say, why is the president important? You have fair game to do that.
Like an overview in your opinion of what
Just
you learned, kind of?
Not just what you learn. What are you going to do with that?
Effects.
How are you going to apply it? So it's not and then we talked about this and we talked about that. So now it's like, this is what impacted me. When we talked about this subject, this is an area where I could be more mindful of it, or this is an area that I need to look at, or personal. And so when you hand in your essays, what we're going to do is we're going to collect your essays, and then you're going to have to stand up in front of the group, and you're going to have to share for like 5 minutes. Basically your essay. And I'm doing that for a reason. And so basically what the essay should be is a persuasive essay. You're persuading me using personal examples on why it's important. You want to convince me that whatever you're saying is important. If it helps, think of somebody who doesn't live in America and doesn't have the same ideal that we have. And the reason we're doing it without the notes and without the essay is I know that you can write something and you can read it. Real application comes when we internalize it and when we're able to convince other people of it. So that's it. Good job. I think we went over that pretty quick today. So
Thank you.
all right, yeah. So next week, what do you think?
So what would I have to do it on?
You just take the Second and Third Amendments, and then kind of like Kayla did, you can just give us a broad overview.